Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our virtual Enlightenment Salon of August 7th, 2022. Today, we have a conversation for you about another promising distributed autonomous organization, the CureDAO, which is a community-owned and governed platform for abolishing suffering and genetic slavery and democratizing clinical research. So today, I'm proud to offer you this conversation in collaboration with our distinguished U.S. Transhumanist Party officers, our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, and our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer, and our three guests from CureDAO are Andreas Melhede, whom you may be familiar with from our previous virtual Enlightenment salons, as well as Lukas Vogel and Mike P. Sinn, who will now present about CureDAO. So Mike, you have the floor. Please tell us what this new initiative is about.
Thank you so much for your generous introduction. And yes, so our goal is to accelerate clinical research through making it possible for individuals to participate in very large-scale decentralized clinical trials, which will kind of enable the realization of personalized medicine, which is not currently possible due to the current clinical trial design and regulatory framework that is in place for most modern clinical trials. So it costs about $1 billion to get a new intervention to market, and it's about almost $50,000 per subject in a phase 3 clinical trial. And as a result of this, we have next to no long-term toxicology data on the 3.5 pounds of about 7,000 chemicals that are just generally recognized as safe by the FDA. So they can basically be prescribed to everyone all the time without their knowledge, without any data on the long-term effects. So our goal is to use new technologies and in new novel incentivization mechanisms to incentivize individuals to share their data in large stratified pools of that can be used to calculate the long-term effects of different foods and drugs and nutritional supplements. So ultimately, the goal is to and what we've been working on is the goal to aggregate data from formal clinical trials, medical records and insurance records, diet data from receipts, electronic receipts, and manually entered data using any of the existing diet tracking applications, nutritional supplements, and drugs, and then create a digital twin or black box model for the individual, for participant, whereby we can identify the optimal inputs that would produce the desired output, whether that be a reduction of depression scores or pain ratings or any other health outcome that one wishes to optimize. So in my background's in electrical engineering and physics, and then I did about root cause failure analyses at an industrial testing laboratory for about 10 years. And then I eventually developed a number of different conditions like anxiety and depression and psoriasis and arthritis, and I had to go to physical therapy like twice a week and could barely turn my head. And so my doctor sent me to lots of different specialists, which each like used intuition to prescribe a lot of different pharmaceuticals. However, after like 10 years of that, I was still very miserable. So I started applying the same kind of techniques that we used at my laboratory to figure out what the hell was wrong with me. So I began recording like all my symptoms and treatments and any other factor that could in diet, any other factor that could influence it with a ton of different applications and devices, and then exported all of this data and combined it, and then applied pharmacokinetic modeling and other forms of causal inference algorithms to identify the strongest factors predicting my symptom severity. So I identified that all of these different conditions were kind of correlated and related over time, which I hadn't observed intuitively, but the severity to a great degree was correlated with some time shifts. And I also identified that consumption of gluten and lectins typically resulted in increased symptom severity about 2 days after I consumed them. And and I had to abstain from like gluten and lectin intake for about 10 days before the symptoms would go away. So the human brain evolved to survive on the African savanna millions of years ago in a world without data. So it doesn't really have the ability to take into account all of the hundreds of factors in daily life that can be contributing to or exacerbating, in particular, these inflammation mediated diseases. And inflammation is also a key driver in aging as well. So our goal is to ultimately quantify every single factor and its effects. And kind of the easiest way to illustrate that is through these outcome labels that we've been generating using data acquired from about 10,000 participants and about 12 million data points to kind of calculate the typical change from baseline in different symptoms after administration of different interventions, like in this case, melatonin. So in order to make it as easy as possible for lots of other people to do this themselves, we've developed this kind of application. This is just an initial application that allows anybody to record their symptom severity and then all their interventions that they're taking manually if they want, or import existing data on environmental factors like air quality and daylight exposure, right, entering their zip code, and physical activity and sleep and productivity and vital signs, a lot of other data sources. And then we create N of 1 studies automatically based on the data that we get after applying kind of causal inference, because we are so interested in simple correlations. We are more interested in which factors are predictive and influencing outcomes. So there's a number of rules for causality I can get into later if anyone's interested. But this is like an example of an N of 1 study that we generate. So like my guiltiness is typically about 11% lower following increases in physical activity over the past week. And then we generate a lot of visualizations that kind of illustrate the analysis and look and see if it is a cumulative effect. So here you can see like the physical activity over the previous 32 days has a lot more effect than physical activity over the previous day. And then also apply this kind of time-lagged combination of the time series data to see if it's like just a correlation, like a coincidence that they happen at the same time, or if it is a causal relationship, whereas you will see like there's temporal delay typically between a cause and an effect. So in pharmacokinetic modeling, an example would be if you take an aspirin, if you have a headache and you take an aspirin, typically there's a 30-minute onset delay before your headache starts to go away. And then the duration of action is typically about 4 hours, I guess, for aspirin. So we take into account those and then a number of other causal inference mechanisms and kind of generate a PubMed style natural language study for individuals. So like I have thousands of N of 1 studies, and then we aggregate all of the N of 1 studies from the 10,000 people, and then you're able to kind of search for any kind of outcome that you're interested in, and then look and see what the typical factors are that are most improving it or exacerbating it. And then we have a number of ways of visualizing it. But yeah, the best, kind of the most easy to understand way is through these outcome labels. And so even though we have data from a lot of people and about 12 million data points, the data is very broad in terms of lots of outcomes and interventions, but it's very shallow. So in the case of this like B complex and folic acid supplement and inflammatory pain, there's only a couple of people in this study. However, there are about 50 exabytes or approximately of human generated data. But it's all siloed, which is an issue that we're trying to address using a new novel incentive mechanism that hasn't currently been used. There have been lots of efforts, such as Google Health and Microsoft Health Vault, at finding ways to aggregate data from lots of different sources, but none have been successful so far due to the fact that these are centralized entities which would maintain a lot of the ownership and have a significant advantage over all of the participant like data silos. There's about 350,000 digital health apps and electronic health record systems and various other data silos with human health data that could enable us to have very precise outcome labels that show the effects. And what our objective is to overcome the prisoner's dilemma that would prevent them from doing this data sharing. So the means by which we're doing that is facilitating easy interoperability between all of the data sources and shared ownership of a centralized DeSci exchange, which would be analogous to kind of a DeFi exchange, where individuals can monetize their data, and then the applications can receive transaction fee for facilitating the sharing of data, so that the 350,000 apps can share data with the other 350,000 apps, and so that's basically a brief overview, and I can go into more detail if you want. And yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Mike, for that overview. Now, there is an interesting question that I would like to raise from one of our viewers, John H. He writes, it seems like a lot of the data points are going to come down to subjective judgments about how one feels after a particular intervention, like guiltiness or anger, for example. Or wouldn't there have to be some sort of subjective judgment on the part of the person entering the data as to how severe that was?
Subjective. And so we kind of, when we aggregate the data, we don't aggregate the direct raw measurements. So like one person's 3 out of 5 guiltiness or whatever is going to be different, not comparable to another person's 3 out of 5 guiltiness. They might be too, the way that we don't see the same colors, but we can see if their guiltiness kind of change, or whatever outcome they're rating, changes some percentage from baseline. And then if another person's like guiltiness is worse or better as a result following some intervention, they will also get like a percent change from baseline. And you can aggregate the typical change from baseline, whereas you can't really aggregate the subjective raw like guiltiness ratings, because it is so subjective and inconsistent among participants. I don't know if that answers the question.
So
that was good.
The metric that is more relevant, especially for aggregation purposes, is the relative change in the self-reported severities of these states, rather
Correct.
than the absolute magnitudes.
Right. That is correct. You can
Yes.
aggregate the relative change, but not the absolute change.
Yes. So another question is with regard to the interface between common health apps and the exchange that you're creating. So how would that work from the
Yeah.
standpoint of if you have like a Fitbit or a Strava app or a Garmin or something that tracks your sleep or something that tracks meditation, how would that interface with the aggregation system that allows one to view all of these insights?
Right. There's about two ways to do this. So one way is using our API. So we've created a application programming interface. So any application is able to include a list of the different connector data sources and then enable their users to connect to those different sort APIs and then import their data. And then another way is through a software development kit that we are developing that individuals can include in their application that embeds the data marketplace component and then the data sharing components. And then we are also currently developing what we're kind of calling the human file system, which is a modified version, if you're familiar, of a Gnosis safe, and which enables individuals to store their data in currently kind of off chain, and then enable the storage of credentials linking to this off-chain data in a Gnosis safe or a modified version thereof that is focused on digital health applications. So currently Gnosis safes they are multi-signature safes that allow like DAOs and things to kind of store their shared assets. And they have a great SDK which allows integration applications to interact with the assets, their NFTs, and other assets in their safe. And so we have developed this thing called the self-sovereign health record, which allows people to kind of upload different types of data, encode it in an NFT, and protect it using this thing called the ceramic lit protocol, and share it with physicians currently, and then also make it available in a marketplace. So we're working on integrating that with kind of the Gnosis Safe idea, and so I'm not sure. Hopefully that will answer the question. There's kind of some legal questions regarding GDPR regulations. You have the right to be forgotten. So it's not entirely clear whether it is legal to store any data, like health data, on chain. However, you can store credentials to off-chain data, like time-limited ones, and then sell those in the form of an NFT to data buyers, which can access the data that way. That's one implementation, but there's some more I can get into if anyone's interested.
Very interesting. So this offers a way for people to monetize their individual health data and earn some small amount of revenue from the act of sharing the data for research purposes with other entities.
Right. Yes, it's very analogous to the current DeFi exchanges, which are mostly governed by DAOs. And typically an exchange will take maybe like 0.5% or 1% of a transaction fee, which goes to the token holders in the DAO, the people who originally invested in the exchange, and then the individual gets like 99.5% or whatever. So it would be a similar mechanism where the application that has integrated our SDK and Safe into it would receive like 0.5%, and then potentially the DAO itself that has to manage the infrastructure and maintain that would receive 0.5% as well, and then the individual would receive about 99% of the money from the transaction. And this would be significantly more efficient than the current method. There's about $60 billion spent on anonymized electronic health records, which are currently going to EHR systems such as Cerner. And so currently individuals are not receiving any compensation for their data, and it's mostly these large centralized entities that are doing that. And additionally, mostly they're only providing these EHR records, which have a lot of mistakes because the frequency is about on average like every 3 months at best. And so they have the problem of flawed human memories, the telephone game of things that they're saying not getting written down correctly. And so we think this data will be a lot more valuable to pharmaceutical companies, which utilize it for clinical discovery purposes, and insurance companies, and then additionally for kind of post-marketing pharmacovigilance, which is going to become more and more necessary as there's a drug called Aduhelm, which is used to clear amygdaloid plaque, which is likely to be a factor influencing Alzheimer's disease, but it's not a clinical endpoint. So the FDA typically had not approved drugs based on what's amygdaloid plaque, which is a surrogate endpoint. So in exchange, but the reason that they couldn't use the clinical endpoint is because it's a preventative. Aduhelm is a preventative drug. So you have to start taking it about 20 years earlier, at the very earliest onset of Alzheimer's, to prevent the development. And so it's not financially feasible to run a 20-year clinical trial. So now we have phase 4 trials, and a FDA, what they call the Framework for Real World Evidence, which was released in 2016 in the 21st Century Cures Act. So they're starting to recognize real world human generated data as supporting evidence in applications for interventions.
Yes, thank you for that answer, Mike. And it's fascinating also to note that the regulatory environment very slowly is beginning to catch up to the promise of these emerging technologies. But of course, a lot more work needs to be done on this front. And hopefully, the emergence of a platform like CureDAO will offer a proof of concept that regulators will have to wrestle with, so to speak, in developing a framework that would allow the systematic study of this information and hopefully the emergence of viable and approved treatments from that information. Now, our friend Jason Mallory has an interesting question. What AI diagnostic tool or tools will be able to access this health data? Do you have any plans for this?
Yes. So any tool that wants to integrate with the SDK and is authorized by the individual user would be able to access the data and then apply added value. So we're currently pursuing a kind of a WordPress model of as it's like kind of one of the most successful open source projects in history, and so the way they achieved great success was having an open source core, which could be trusted by 59,000 plugin developers. So originally it was just designed to be a blogging platform. However, the plugin framework enabled developers to make it usable in a wide array of business use cases. So the core of CureDAO is basically just the data sharing and the data sharing component of it, and then transformations to make it usable for existing software, regardless of kind of the current data format they're using. So there's been a lot of effort to standardize health data, but has been a generally failure so far, due to kind of a ton of existing legacy software that would be very expensive to update to conform to like the FHIR standard, which is the current like prevalent one they're focusing on standardizing to. But we see a better alternative as in creating data transformation modules, so that anybody can submit data in any format that it already exists in and is useful to them. And then it goes through a data transformer, which converts to kind of an internal standardized format. And then whenever data is requested, then it can also be requested in any type of format that is desired, so that there isn't a bunch of duplication of effort of refactoring existing legacy EHR or applications to make them compatible with a single standard. It will enable just anyone to create a new kind of data transformation plugin and then easily access the data. So the plugin, so we're following kind of the plugin framework that WordPress has. And plugins would include machine learning models, health dashboards, clinical trial matching tools, data marketplaces. And so these are kind of all outside the scope of CureDAO and would be independent businesses or plugin developers that could monetize that however they desire. And so and we just want to include kind of the basic core features that are required to facilitate interoperability between all 350,000 digital health applications and EHRs and things like that. I don't know. Hopefully that kind of answers the question.
Yes, I think it does. And now I would like to also ask Lukas and Andreas to provide their introductory comments, anything to supplement Mike's presentation. And then it seems, Mike, you have some other slides that you could delve into as fits any of the other questions we received from our audience. But Lukas, tell us more about your involvement with CureDAO, what motivated you to participate in this effort, and any insights you have to share with us about it.
Yes, of course. Hey guys, so it's an honor to be here, and yes, I'm a medical doctor from Germany with large interest in new technologies and cutting edge technologies, to be honest. And I'm not very satisfied with the current healthcare system in Germany or all of the healthcare systems I know of. So I have been involved in the blockchain space for quite a long time, following certain DAO projects, but I decided that I will be able, or I hope to be able, to change the way we define medicine or personalized medicine. And so I was searching for some DAOs to get to work with and to look for some cool projects. And I found CureDAO, and I had a call with Mike, and I got to know Andreas as well. And I really loved the idea and all the passion behind the project. And what I really loved about the idea is that it's more about helping people than really making money from it. So this is something I was looking for, and I'm very much always love to hear how Mike presents the idea and the overall vision, because I think he does it really well, and I think it's more of an I think everyone can feel the passion about the overall idea behind it. And I would hope to have or somehow shift the power more to the people through technology. So I would be happy to, for me, it's much about the idea of shared decision making. So it's pretty big. It's a pretty big idea in medicine, which is taught in medical school, at least in Germany. And I think without solutions like that, it will not be possible to have some equal expert solution on your own health, to have some good conversations with your medical doctor, to, if there is need for it, to supply information and find the right decisions for you, not what is basically taught in school books or very outdated books, but rather cutting edge scientific knowledge and research-based information. So yes, I love to be on the team, and I think that's it from my side.
Yes, well, thank you, Lukas, for those remarks. And indeed, I am quite fond of this personalized approach that CureDAO takes in analyzing all of the multifaceted potential contributing influences to a person's symptoms. And I have to say, from my personal experience, it seems like every individual over the age of about 30 experiences some sort of like lingering suboptimality in terms of symptoms, phenomena that aren't quite right. And it actually surprised me how early this starts happening to most people. And of course, it does happen to some people under 30, but if you're under 30 and have been fortunate enough to avoid those kinds of symptoms thus far, it may not take long for them to happen to you. But they're different symptoms for different individuals. And because our lives are so complex and we're embedded in a world that has thousands, if not millions, of potential influences upon us, it's difficult to just use our own logic to disambiguate those influences. So this kind of systematic approach is very helpful, I think, in principle, to many patients with a diversity of possible conditions. Now let's go to Andreas. And of course, Andreas is involved in the longevity community in numerous initiatives. So what led you to find CureDAO and become interested in its work, and what insights can you share with us about it?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It's a great honor, and yeah, it's a good question. So, like, to me, as I was known from the last session that I was on back in December, I was involved with basically the organization, together with Jason Mercurio, the ACES partners, where I was focused on different collaborations and initiatives to help advance longevity and health through that as well. And that project that actually got me introduced to CureDAO. So he was personally collaborating a bit with CureDAO and talking with Mike and other people from the DAO that I got introduced to it. And like initially, it's the whole vision of it, like it's so grand and it's so big, and like it seems like it can really fundamentally just like shift everything. And like the moment that I realized that, like I just felt like this is something that just has to happen. And this is so strange how it already hasn't happened. Like just how we're seeing this exponential increase in data for so long, for all these different products and initiatives and organizations and projects, etc. that just pop up, but basically aren't collaborating. They're just focusing on the profits in terms of actually, instead of actually focusing on what matters, which is the health piece. So getting all this data together, it just means that every single individual worldwide will actually be able to actually control their health and personalize their health given the symptoms and everything. And like, to me, just this whole vision is just a way to fundamentally shift the healthcare sector to actually incentivize health outcomes rather than actual profits, and actually keeping people sick exactly how it should actually have been created in the first place. So to me, it just was really a no-brainer of like producing this and creating this. And so like, I've just been so passionate about hearing this vision that Mike basically put together, and just so glad to be on board and to help move this forward. And yeah, like as soon as this is in place and we just get all this put together with as many health organizations as possible to really get this data as precise and as useful as possible, then like it can really shift the whole health puzzle, as well as making people live longer as well. So this just ties together with every single person's biology on the planet, and I just so appreciate, and I'm so glad to be part of this. And yeah, I just can't wait to help make this happen. And yeah, this is just a fundamental shift that just has to happen, and finally, well.
Yes. Thank you, Andreas, for that answer. And for those of our viewers who want to learn a bit more about Andreas's work, please watch our virtual Enlightenment Salon from December 19th, 2021, with Andreas as well as Jason Mercurio of Ageless Partners, which is another great organization promoting longevity today. And indeed, there has been quite a proliferation of longevity-oriented organizations recently. Of course, CureDAO is an example. We had an interview with Fred Zhang of Longevity DAO on our previous Virtual Enlightenment Salon during July 31st. And then Fred interviewed me yesterday in a Twitter Spaces AMA. So I will share the links to both of those. So the concept of the DAO, the decentralized autonomous organization, or the distributed autonomous organization, has been around since essentially the Ethereum platform was founded, but it seems to have just greatly proliferated in the past year. And I'm curious, for any of our three guests, what do you think motivated this proliferation of the DAO concept so recently? What factors changed to make that idea more viable, not just as a general format of an organization, but in the longevity space in particular?
I think that VitaDAO had a lot to do with it, and it was kind of like a match on a big pile of wood, and then yeah, I can't really think of any others. Maybe somebody else can, but any other specific event that would trigger kind of the exponential growth. Then there's like the Constitution DAO, so that would be another like kind of initial big media event that could have raised awareness to the even existence in the minds of lots of people, which was able to raise like about $60 million in just a few days. So I think that's probably the reason. In our case, the DAO component is very critical because there were a couple, like I said, Google Health and Microsoft Health Vault and other big platforms that have tried to do this before, but due to privacy risks and the risk of litigation and regulatory risk, both of those shut down. And so in our DAO, the tokenomics are such that the individual data owners would be the primary owners and beneficiaries from the DAO, and primary decision makers have the most governing power over the DAO as well. So theoretically, by definition, it should never kind of act against their interests. If there were some kind of class action lawsuit, they would basically be suing themselves. And then if there were some kind of bureaucratic government regulation that prohibited progress and was kind of outdated, they would basically have to make the case that they are the ones who own these people's data as opposed to the individuals themselves. And then the second largest token holder are the various integration partners. So so it wasn't too easy before to have to hire a lawyer and set up contracts to facilitate cooperation and collaboration between entities like this. But now that ownership of an entity like this is easily fractionalized and distributed based on contributions, we can easily reward all of these 350,000 silos, and hopefully, to the extent that we overcome the barriers to collaboration. And all of the data in isolation is not incredibly useful. So what we have today, since we have little collaboration, is lots of kind of dashboards with historical, descriptive statistics that kind of tell us what we have done, which we kind of already know. But what we need is to know what we should do in the future, and you have to have the aggregation from all of the different sources in order to attain that useful insight. So yes, so and then there was another question. I don't know. Did you have something next? Because I saw a question in the chat about the government regulatory barriers to.
Yes, please go ahead and address that.
Okay, great. Thank you. So yeah, I've done a lot of research on the historical historical clinical research and how it's changed over time. And so we're kind of also working on another kind of DAO, which would be a decentralized FDA, which kind of makes policy decisions based on the aggregate wisdom of thousands of experts, hopefully, instead of these centralized bodies that are kind of susceptible to regulatory capture by industry, and then suffer a lot of personal kind of distorted incentives, whereby if you have a intervention that is likely to save 1,000 lives, but it would harm one person in a visible way, then it is in the interest of the regulator to just reject the approval, the application for this intervention, because they could make somebody could write a news story, and then that would make the agency look bad, and then harm their career. So, however, it's difficult to write a news story about the 1,000 people who have died due to lack of access to this intervention. So here's kind of like an illustration I made about a news story that would never exist, because you can't take a picture of precisely who would still be alive today. Every time they do approve a drug and say this is going to save 50,000 lives a year, and we have a system that delayed the availability of that intervention, that means that 500,000 people died over the previous 10 years while it was not available. And so I did a lot of research about how clinical efficacy and safety was done in the past. So if we look at historically, human lifespan has been flat for many, many years. And then starting around 1890, there's the beginning of this exponential growth in the average age of death. And this, I was trying to figure out what corresponded with this initiating event. And then we also saw a very strangely linear growth rate from 1890 until 1960 or so. And so I was trying to figure out what would cause like a sudden shift decline in this rate of growth in the average age of death. So the only kind of thing I could find was that the Journal of the American Medical Association was founded around 1890, and that's when we started using the scientific method to determine the side effects and the effectiveness of different interventions, life-saving interventions, and other things. So there were a lot of factors at the time, but it seems like something happened around 1890 or some combination of things, and something changed around 1960. So in the 50s, so there weren't really any safety trials until about 1940, when there was this elixir sulfidamide that caused a lot of child deaths, and that's when the FDA started requiring safety trials. And so there was still no change after that in the growth of human lifespan, so that didn't seem overly bureaucratic or anything. And then after the 50s, in which there's a drug called thalidomide that caused thousands of birth defects around the world. However, the U.S. Safety requirements prevented it from being available in the United States. So there were actually no birth defects or people that suffered from that in the United States. Yet there were still a lot of news stories. So there was a public outcry for increasing regulation and slowing down the regulatory process in favor of caution. So in 1962 was when the FDA started implementing their own kind of efficacy trial requirements. They already had safety ones that protected us, but prior to this, efficacy trials were basically large-scale N of 1 aggregated studies run by the Journal of the American Medical Association, and there are about 144,000 doctors in the American Medical Association that would be allowed to give their patients the option to try experimental treatments that had gone through safety trials already, and then record the outcomes for a wide array of conditions for a very diverse population. But in 1960, the FDA began running these, or changed the system to basically make it illegal to do these large-scale, diverse, independently run, AMA-run trials, and instead shifted efficacy trials to pharmaceutical companies. So pharmaceutical companies have kind of a conflict of interest in the trials, and they also started requiring that people, they pick the outcome endpoints in advance. So there was an example, like the first effective kind of cancer drug for prostate cancer was around 2010. And so they kind of filled out their FDA application forms incorrectly and picked the wrong endpoint. So they didn't pick preventing death as an endpoint, even though it prevented mortality from prostate cancer. Their drug application was rejected, and then they had to declare bankruptcy, even though they produced an effective drug, but didn't they selected some other kind of cancer endpoints and didn't pick the right one. So that is another problem with the new clinical trial framework that was imposed in 1960. So after 1960, when they kind of took this out of the hands of the AMA, there was a 70% reduction in new treatments available. Prior to that, there was about, there were on average like 300 of new interventions a year. And then after that, it went down to around 90 a year. And and the price of developing a new drug kind of exploded exponentially after that as more regulations accumulated. And maybe coincidentally, at that time, we saw a sudden change in the slope of growth in human lifespan from what was previously 4-year increase every decade after being flat forever to a 2-year increase every decade. So kind of our goal, like with the decentralized FDA, is to find micronations that might be interested in, such as Prospera, which is a new economic zone on the island of Roatan in Honduras, which has the right to adopt a wide variety of regulatory frameworks. So we're hoping to kind of create a model of what may be possible with a better regulatory system that kind of overcomes a lot of the problems with the current one. And I probably talked too long. So, but I can go into some of the other ways we can improve our current clinical trial system if anyone is interested later.
Yes, absolutely. I think we should delve into that. Before we do, we have a few questions from our viewers. So first of all, Aaron EJ asks, what connections with existing governmental bodies have been initiated so far? And you mentioned this Prospera economic zone, which seems to be quite intriguing. I am going to have to research it myself, but do you anticipate that this kind of approach, especially because you are gathering a lot of individuals' data, would entail some sort of collaboration with governmental entities just to make sure that the approach is compliant with the laws of particular jurisdictions or doesn't impinge upon those laws or routes around those laws in some way?
Right. So we currently, I've been in kind of talks with some people in the All of Us program at the National Institute of Health, which is a $4 billion program, to do something very similar to what we're doing. However, there are a lot of regulatory barriers that prevent them from collecting like a wide array of very useful high frequency longitudinal treatment and outcome data, which is necessary for effective clinical discovery. So right now they have a very kind of narrow set of clinical data. And regarding the regulatory discussions, I think it's going to be potentially very difficult to provoke any change at in a large state such as the United States. But so that is why kind of a strategy would be to focus on micronations and medical tourism, and then illustrate like kind of what's possible. Typically throughout history, I think most change has come not from changing existing systems internally, but just by creating external, better, superior options. So the existing inferior systems eventually just kind of become redundant and then lose public support. But if anyone has any connections to governmental regulatory bodies, it would be great to begin discussions with them. Any nation.
Yes, indeed. Well, we have always stated within the U.S. Transhumanist Party that once one country, whatever the size of the country may be, whatever the jurisdiction may be, adopts some of these policies that are friendly to longevity research and medical freedom, others will follow suit once they see the results. Also, your comments reminded me of the famous statement by R. Buckminster Fuller, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So you are doing that here. Now, before we go to the questions about improving clinical trials, because this is an area where you've done considerable research, I want to ask Jason Geringer to pose some of the questions that he has developed.
Going back right to the thing about micronations, just running the thought model, I can't find a reason, or a thought experiment. I can't really find a reason why wouldn't they? I mean, really, why wouldn't they? I mean, what could go wrong? And I don't mean that in like, a funny way, what could go wrong, but for real, why wouldn't they? I mean,
right. There's a reason the big ones do not do that, or there's like I guess so. There's a human bias towards this acts of commission versus acts of omission. So if you just do nothing and then allow a million people to die, and then like you can't really go to prison for that. But if you approve a drug that causes one person to die, then you're legally liable, and there's like public public outrage against it. So I think those things kind of might still apply in micronations, but the hope is that we can get some regulatory agencies that have kind of a more utilitarian calculus in their policy making. I don't know how common they are. I haven't found a great one yet, but I think Prospera is kind of the best first example of a entity that kind of recognizes that that there are a lot of ways that there are much more benefits from freedom generally than harm from freedom. So yes, I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, that is a good answer. I didn't even really think about it that way. Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
The other thing, when you mentioned earlier about digital proxies, and that is a super awesome idea. I'm wondering what exactly though do you mean by digital proxies? Do you mean like just basically a bucket of data, or do you mean that bucket of data has like a cognitive architecture around it, and it's a thinking thing, can handle your data and negotiate for you, and a whole can almost maybe not a full-fledged AGI, but can be doing stuff
Right.
with your.
Yeah, my dream is to have one that like answers all my emails for me. But
Yeah. Right.
but yeah, so our focus is just like there are a lot of like there have been digital twins like used in marketing basically for a long time to like predict what decision a consumer is going to make. But currently, due to all the siloing of the data and stuff, and it's highly proprietary and closed, so regular humans can't really benefit from it. Companies that are doing advertising can. So our focus is getting
when it comes to training a cognitive architecture, this is going to be gold data. I mean, if you want to train cognitive architecture to be like a person, a particular person, this is
Right.
exactly the data you need. And then
Right.
this is awesome. I love what you're doing.
Yeah.
Where most people are just like think, oh, I got a great idea. You're like, okay, I mean, you're doing it. That's awesome.
Don't have anything better to do. But yeah, so the first step is like, aggregating all the data and then letting individuals have control over it. And then through this kind of plug-in marketplace, then there are a ton of great AI models, but there's currently not enough training data to produce kind of the digital twins that we want. And the focus of the use case of the digital twin for our platform is to like have like a metaverse of decentralized like virtual clinical trials where our digital twins are basically participating in them instead of real humans having to do them all. But yeah, there are a ton of other awesome use cases that will be possible with this data because we're kind of the platform that we have now. It just aggregates any types of time series regarding human generated data. So it could be applicable to kind of automating a ton of individual tasks that currently have to be done by the human and delegating those to your surrogate digital twin or digital slave or whatever it would be called.
We should introduce you to the guys over at AGI Lab because they're developing cognitive architectures that could go over top of this, and this could be something even on a whole nother level.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, we're really excited about collaborating and integrating with any existing. So yeah, our focus right now is, I guess, just the pharmacokinetic modeling so far. But ultimately we want there's much better AI and machine learning dudes in the world than me. So It would be great if we can easily provide them with training data and then allow them to derive a lot more value than we currently are able to. So that's kind of what the plugins and the kind of app marketplace framework that analogous to WordPress would include.
Yes, excellent. Well, thank you for those responses, Mike. And it seems that the idea of a digital twin or digital surrogate that can perform tasks such as answering emails resonates a lot with our viewers. It certainly does resonate with me, though I do think there would need to be some sort of norm or protocol established to prevent an outcome where my digital twin just responds to your digital twin and your digital twin responds back, and they're having this conversation and neither of us are aware of it until a few steps down the road, and then we see, oh, this digital twin of mine committed to the following actions and the other digital twin accepted. And what are we going to do about that?
You'd have to update them really, regularly, because your digital twin over time is always going to become more and more out of sync with you. You know what I mean? Because it's its own thing. So, you'd have to have some way to regularly update. You couldn't just set them free.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, there definitely need to be a lot of safeguards. That's above my pay grade, unfortunately.
Yes. Well, at least there should be some sort of emerging social norm that we authorize our digital twins to provide communications on our behalf, but we screen every communication. We read it before it's sent out. We read the response so that we, as the original biological individuals, are still in control of the conversation. But it would be interesting to have this kind of aid that can generate a proposed communication, and then one could personally proofread it, double check it, make sure that that is what one wants to send, and then one can go ahead and send it.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Not maybe a whole nother different entity, but more like an extension of oneself,
Yeah, it's analogous to like having a personal assistant, very closely, I think. So, typically, they have the potential to make the same kind of mistakes your digital twin would.
That's why I almost would think it might be even better that they were not full on AGI, and because if they were not to the level of humans when it comes to ethics, and just a level below, then I don't know, you could kind of justify morally having them basically, and they'd be sort of in servitude, but not really. There'd be an extension of oneself. But that's a whole deep moral argument there. Go ahead.
Indeed. So our friend John H. just made a generous super chat, and he jokes, "Hey, just leave us out of it, evil twins." So I think it's amusing sometimes to contemplate these kinds of scenarios, because they could lead to different situations, and sometimes they're interesting, sometimes they're amusing, sometimes it's worthwhile to consider what sorts of behaviors would emerge, what sorts of safeguards would emerge as people interface with these technologies and figure out the best ways to apply them. But now I would like to go to Art Ramon if he has a question or a comment, and after that we can delve more into possibilities for decentralized clinical trials.
Yeah, I recently got an Amazfit wearable, and on it, it had the ability to earn Pi, and they call that, what is that? It is Pi stands for Personal Activity Intelligence. So at first I thought it was some sort of crypto, but it's not. It's just a metric. Hey, you earned a Pi. But what sort of wearables are you looking at where you could integrate getting tokens in the crypto that you're offering? How would that work?
Pretty much all of them. These are the plugins basically. So anybody, that's another kind of advantage of having a DAO and an open source framework similar to WordPress. Whereas there are some individual data aggregation services and businesses that are great, and we'd like to integrate with them. But it's like very difficult. There's kind of an exponential growth in the number of data sources. Like there's 350,000 apps. There's all these new devices every day. And so the ability of any company is kind of limited in its bandwidth and finances that would be required to create a new integration for every single data source. Whereas if we take more of a Wikipedia approach, it's Microsoft and Carta and Wikipedia are kind of a good analogy. Microsoft spent billions of dollars hiring thousands of PhDs to write Microsoft and Carta. And within about 2 years of the creation of Wikipedia, it had about 50 times as much content as Microsoft and Carta, and approximately equivalent error rate, according to a number of studies, and at the cost of a few $1 billion less. So we can do the same thing with the development of these different plugins and integrations. So it'll allow a much more diverse array of data inputs. Yeah, and if you consider all of the different electronic health systems, currently, like every hospital has its own its own data formats and digital health system. So even the All of Us program, which has been most specifically focused on aggregating from healthcare systems, like they're unable to import from any of the hospitals or doctors' offices that I've been to, and I've been to a lot of them. So that is a big challenge that is going to be very difficult to overcome for a single organization. Whereas if it's distributed among thousands or hopefully like millions of developers or businesses, then we can progress a lot faster as far as interoperability and import. I don't know. Hopefully that answers it.
Yes, thank you for that response, Mike. And indeed, it seems thus far the promise of electronic health records has been dashed a bit by the lack of compatibility across many of the systems where medical information is recorded. So there might be a bit more accuracy in the records maintained by a particular medical practice, but it's still very difficult to share that information. And I know as a patient who sees multiple doctors, it is still the patient's responsibility to provide all of that information to each new medical practitioner because they don't communicate with one another, and they certainly don't have ways right now to get information from your fitness tracker or any other device where you might have relevant data.
Right, indeed. And so with all this isolation, I think kind of analogy I use a lot is that of a pencil. So if you're familiar with Milton Friedman, his description of in the 80s about how it takes like thousands of people to create a pencil, thousands of uncoordinated actors, somebody to cut down the rubber tree, somebody to mine the iron ore for the chainsaw, somebody to mine the graphite, somebody to make every entity and make their breakfast and all of this stuff. Yet despite the massive human labor requirement and coordination problem that is required to produce it, it costs less than 10 cents to do it because we have a free market. Whereas if you what we currently have now in digital health is a much more like North Korea, where we have like basically 350,000 little North Koreas that aren't trading with each other, don't have like incentives to do this, aren't rewarded to do it. And you can see North Korea's GDP over time compared to a much more free trade nation such as South Korea, which has been increasing at an exponential pace. And it's kind of all based on the ability of us to kind of stand on each other's shoulders more, as opposed to duplicating effort, which is what we've had in digital health a lot. There's a ton of like fundamental infrastructure that just has to keep getting rebuilt over and over again in these closed source code repositories. So you have all these programmers like writing the exact same features over and over. Whereas like in the case of WordPress, like all the framework is already there, and the plugin developers can just like create some new unique value proposition that's built on the existing platform, plus all the other existing plugins that are available. They can integrate with each other, so that ultimately we'll be able to make a lot more progress and start producing, like using all of this wasted money on duplication of effort for like smart toilets and better AI algorithms and lots more things that will ultimately reduce human suffering and and reduce costs. So extend lifespan.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for that response. And I certainly share that hope with you. The sooner that future comes about, the better. Now, let's delve into decentralized clinical trials a bit more, because as you pointed out, with the data on human lifespans, clinical trials are a salutary phenomenon. We should have them. We should have a scientific approach to testing for both safety and for efficacy. The problem is that the monopolistic approach of the FDA has, especially since 1962, greatly hindered the rate of progress, because the barriers to conducting those clinical trials have become prohibitively high in most cases. So how do we overcome that issue?
Right. So we can overcome it. One way is by kind of driving down the cost of this research through decentralized clinical trials. So it costs about 5x to somewhere, it varies depending on the intervention and the outcomes being measured, but between 5x and 14x cheaper than clinical trials are currently. So the cost barrier is massive to making a new intervention, such that in many cases, even if you have a genius scientist who develops some great new intervention that will actually cure a disease, as opposed to just kind of masking the symptoms, which is what most of them do now, the kind of incentive is, it's kind of very difficult for some scientists to raise $1 billion to do all the legwork and go through the regulatory process. So they have to go to this oligopoly of pharmaceutical companies that do have enough money to get through this process and all of the connections. So and in most cases, a drug, an inferior drug for this condition, already exists. So if they have a drug that is like a lifetime subscription, basically, that mitigates or masks symptoms reasonably effectively, then it's kind of in their interest to just purchase the patent for this cure, this new drug, and then basically just put it on the shelf, because they've already spent $1 billion getting this other drug passed. Now, if they were to spend another $1 billion to get this new cure, superior cure approved, they're risking a 90% chance of rejection, and which is a complete loss. And then they're also just losing billions of dollars of revenue that they're already making from these lifetime subscriptions. So I think it's critically important that we come up with a way supply side solutions to reduce this activation energy that is required. So, and one way that we're focusing on doing that is by enabling people to, it's about $50,000 per subject in a phase 3 clinical trial. So there's a huge initial upfront cost and risk if you are developing a new intervention. So if we can kind of allow people to participate in trials initially for free, but have a chain of custody from their data to the intervention, and then provide them with lifetime royalties effectively once an intervention is successfully monetized, then we could potentially give them far greater rate of return for participating in the trials and reduce the initial barrier and activation energy to even going through with the trials. So we could get information on a lot more like formal interventions. And then there are also about 7 billion natural experiments that are going on every day. So ideally, you would be able to have like an RCT for every one of these 7,000 chemicals that we're eating, but that's not financially viable. And there are a lot of studies that have shown that observational research is actually produces the extremely similar results to randomized controlled trials in the case of a wide array of conditions and interventions. So early in the 80s, there was lots of skepticism about that because there was a study that showed that the effect size in observational research was larger, likely due to the placebo effect and things. But there's more recent research has applied more modern and sophisticated statistical methods, and meta-analyses showed that these observational studies using like existing health records, electronic health records, produced like extremely similar results on the effects of these head-to-head interventions on mortality and on a lot of different health outcomes as well. So there's kind of this religious opposition to anything other than a double-blind placebo-controlled RCT in like the current system, despite the fact that we have evidence, especially in the case of mortality. Typically, death is not a placebo effect. So we really need to be taking advantage of like this ocean of data. And then there's another concern that people have about using observational data relative to randomized controlled double-blind trial data, and that is the fact that let me see here. Thank you for your patience. Okay, so the fact that you don't have a control group, but in reality, we can engage in repeated A/B experiments where if you aren't taking an intervention for an extended period of time, you're basically acting as your own control group in this period. And then if you begin taking an intervention such as rapamycin or any kind of lifespan extending intervention, or if you have arthritis pain and then and you try curcumin or something, then you're then in the experimental group. Then you take that for a month and then you stop taking it and you're representing a new control group. And the more times you repeat this process, the more confidence you have that the intervention is actually producing the outcome. Then if you repeat this process among like thousands or millions of people, there's the law of large numbers that will also cause a lot of canceling out of noise, other random factors that will influence it. Then there's also the plausible mechanism of biochemical action by which a predictor could have an effect. So we kind of crowdsource this. There's not really algorithms good at calculating that at this time. So we basically use like a voting methodology to kind of crowdsource that component. And then there's a lot of existing research. You can calculate the consistency with all the trials at clinicaltrials.gov, which has a great database and API of pretty much every clinical trial you could imagine. Just one kind of barrier to that is lots of them use different kind of outcome metrics. So it's very difficult and arduous to create meta-analyses, but that's a kind of a project we're working on. And then there's the temporal delay issues. So there are a lot of ways that we could be taking far greater advantage of lots of naturally generated human data that is just currently being wasted and disappearing into the ether at this time. Then there was another issue with existing clinical trials, in that in the case of many of them, they have exclusion criteria that prevent them from being conducted on the people who will actually be taking the drugs. In the case of depression, 85% of people with depression are not able to participate in the clinical trials that are supposed to be determining whether it will work for them or not. If you have multiple mental health conditions, if you use drugs or alcohol, if you only have mild depression, if you take other antidepressants, you're excluded. So there's just this weird 15% of people with depression that get to be in the clinical trials. So the results aren't externally valid, and the sample sizes for the trials are extremely small. This is from the FDA for Wellbutrin. There's like millions of people being prescribed a drug based on 36 participants in a trial that's like completely unrepresentative of 85% of real world patients. So if you look at the effectiveness of antidepressants in the real world after trials, it's typically much lower than that in the clinical trials. So there's a lot of flaws in the current approach that we think can be addressed by policy improvements and just through general like citizen science and crowdsourcing much larger scale studies.
Yes, indeed. And of course, recently, a major scientific finding has been the refutation of the serotonin imbalance hypothesis with regard to depression. Essentially, there is no real clinical evidence upon a meta-analysis of the published research that has withstood scrutiny with regard to the idea that depression is actually caused by a chemical imbalance, which has been kind of the working hypothesis for the prescription of these medications for several decades now. And it seems the entire field needs to be evaluated as to the causes of depression. My inkling, of course, I'm not a medical practitioner, is that depression arises from a complex interplay of environmental factors as well as a person's life history, responses to past trauma, and an approach like the one proposed by CureDAO would be much more effective at identifying and disambiguating the strongest influences with regard to a condition like that, and actually empowering an individual to take action rather than taking some one-size-fits-all pill that likely will not be effective for that particular individual.
Indeed. Yeah, and that's basically what we've been trying to do, and those results are very consistent with what we've found so far. Like we've seen a lot of correlations between inflammation and like overall mood generally. So there is a lot of a very strong argument for kind of a inflammatory mechanism of action driving depression, whereby increases in the levels of these inflammatory cytokines in the bloodstream can pass through the blood-brain barrier, and then these redirect some normal neurotransmitter processes towards from producing generally like melatonin and serotonin to these this compound called quinolic acid, which leads to excitotoxicity in activating these receptors in the hippocampus. And that has been consistent with lots of the findings that we've had, and then gluten and some other factors have been consistent with that as well, because those kind of result in the production of this compound called zonulin, which allows toxins like lipopolysaccharide to get into the bloodstream through the small intestine, and then lead to this inflammatory cascade, which results in neuroinflammation. So yeah, that's kind of our finding as well.
Yes, and this opens up an entire new world of possibilities in terms of identifying the causes of these persistent problems that plague many people and actually figuring out customized solutions that work for those individuals as individuals. Now, of course, this requires a different paradigm of personalized medicine. And I'm curious, Lukas, since you are a physician, how easy or how difficult will it be for the medical profession to adopt an approach that essentially seeks custom solutions for each patient and that leverages this immense volume of potentially useful data in order to arrive at those custom solutions?
So I think it all depends with, or largely depends on the age of the physician and of course on the patient, because I've been working in the psychotherapy and psychosomatics clinic for some time now, and we had some bigger discussions on the depression talks as well. And some, from my experience, a lot of patients come very prepared, right? They ask us very specific questions on their health, how everything is connected, what can we do, basically. They have a plan, and there are a lot of patients that won't be able to understand all the things you could even track, right? So it will be very hard for the majority of patients to understand what is possible to be tracked right now, what are all the compounds I'm currently tracking. And from a physician side, even though you might have the medical understanding to track or to understand all the potential health benefits and the idea of personalized medicine, I think you have a big problem with the overall structure of the, at least on the German medical healthcare system, which is largely time-based, right? So you will get paid more if you can get more patients per hour, basically. So you will not have the time to think about any personalized solutions other than your patient has very specific questions. So I think from a doctor or physician perspective, it will be very hard to switch to a more personalized approach unless more and more people take care of their own health and come with very specific questions and very specific ideas so that doctors or physicians can react to it, right? So I think it will take years and many years for physicians to adapt to those new challenges, especially as the overall level of digitalization and stuff like that is pretty low, even in a country like Germany, right? So you still have have quite a lot of physicians struggling with basically communicating with each others, or even sending some electronic health records to another physician, right? So it will be a very tough task to get them on this whole more personalized, technology focused approach that many patients might want for their own health, right? But I think this is a very big problem to tackle, and I think the majority of people will benefit more if they do their own homework, basically with solutions like CureDAO, understanding what could be an issue and maybe even trying to find the solution by themselves and just go with some very specific questions to the physicians. I think this would be probably the best solution in terms of personal well-being, right?
Yes, so the patients should inform themselves, and then they would be able to arrive at the physician's office with intelligent questions, and the physicians would be able to assist them in more targeted ways, in ways they know how to do, in ways they could assist during the very limited time available for the appointment. And that really is a major limitation of contemporary medical care, because the physicians need to see so many patients in order for their business models to be profitable. And so each patient has, maybe on a good day, an hour with that physician. On a less good day, it would be more like 15 minutes. And they have to ask their questions in a way where the physician can assist them directly, unless there's also some email communication provided as part of that service. But the patient still has the responsibility to aggregate, integrate that information, translate it into actionable insights. And this is definitely where a platform like CureDAO can come in. Now, Mike, I have a question along the lines of an idea that you raised earlier, which is that there have been situations where a pharmaceutical company was incentivized to acquire, say, a smaller startup that developed a cure for a disease and then put that cure on the shelf rather than deploy it. So, are you aware of actual instances like this? And if so, is there a way to get those cures onto the market again through some system of incentives?
Right. So I think in general, when that happens, they don't tend to like to publicize it. I think it would be pretty bad PR. So I am not aware. Maybe I think Dan Elton had some good comments related to that. I think he might know, but yeah, I don't have a specific example, but it kind of makes logical sense, and it would be kind of difficult to get an example. But I believe that just reducing the cost overall, so that it's not necessary for a new scientist to have to go to the oligopoly to get funding, because it's also, in addition to the money that's required, it's like a very complex labyrinth of regulatory barriers that are difficult to, I think, to traverse for any new entrant into the space. So I think, yeah, the best way that we can do it is to reduce kind of the initial barrier. And since there has not been any improvement in the rate of growth in human lifespan since like 1962, I'm thinking there has been a massive increase in the budget for the FDA, and the number of pages of regulations that have to be complied with in order to get any new treatment to people that are suffering. So yes, I think any kind of reduction, a movement more towards a independent, third-party, expert-driven efficacy determination mechanism, like the Journal of American Medical Association and the AMA, could potentially dramatically reduce costs and help us get much more precise outcomes for specific patient populations at a much cheaper cost. So, and just reducing the cost is probably the only means that I can think of to overcome this perverse incentive mechanism. But maybe somebody else has some ideas about how we could do that.
Yes, and it would be worthwhile to consider those ideas. I will note that the problem of skyrocketing costs seems to be, if not unique to the healthcare field today, at the very least, healthcare is one of the few fields today where costs have not come down with additional technological progress.
Yeah.
And that speaks to the many perverse incentives in that space. Now, Lukas or Andreas, do you have any ideas about how to systematically reduce not just healthcare costs, but costs of deploying new drugs that would be cures for diseases as opposed to maintenance regimens, essentially?
Yeah. So like this is like an essential part of like why CureDAO exists to me. It's to really drive down these costs exponentially. Like if you already have all this data and would just have more and more and more data, then instead of like spending so much money and so many years and even decades on developing these drugs, like going through trials with these drugs, like even just like say discovering a new compound and having to go through trials to even get into humans, like it can last decades, and the cost of that is just absolutely brutal. So if we already have all this data for all these different things, then like the cost will just be driven down just dramatically. So it's just really about really figuring out the incentives to make sure that we actually focus on the health piece and can actually put all this together. And instead of just having these extensive processes of basically getting allowance to go through all these different trials and having to test it on so many different organisms and animals, etc., to actually get it to a place where we can basically use it. And even at that point, it might actually come to the fact that it's not usable in humans after all, and they just wasted billions of dollars on nothing, basically. So, like, that we already have this data, let's put this to use. Like, I feel like the health data piece is really like a key mediator to really solve this whole problem.
Michael Erdman had a good question about what personal incentives can be devised to promote knowledge engineering throughout the population. And so I think we have a good example of like what motivates people. If you look at this kind of similar, there's another Web3 project called Step In, which has been very successful, and it has achieved about a like $500 million valuation after several months of existence. So let me find this chart real quick of their kind of their growth rate. So they are, as far as I can see, basically kind of like a Ponzi scheme, where they will reward individuals for the number of steps they've taken with these tokens. So they persuade people to buy these like NFT shoes for thousands of dollars with the hopes they will get rich earning taking these steps with them. So they went from basically zero at the beginning of the year to $2.5 billion in a matter of months using effective marketing and kind of psychological manipulation. And then even after the crash of the crypto market, they're still at like $500 million after about 6 months. So so there are a lot of projects that that we're working with that are kind of trying to use similar incentive structures to reward people for participating in studies. And so basically, yeah, our goal is it's for a very good cause. And if that's what it takes to motivate people to do the effort required, because it's at this point not everything is automated. So there's some effort required to kind of record your interventions and record your symptom severity regularly. And the more frequently you record your data, the more valuable it is, as it facilitates better causal inference and things like that. So if it's pretty clear that there are effective ways to motivate people to participate in things with more questionable value than reducing suffering and like saving lives. We have about the equivalent of about 6 Holocausts every year of deaths, and so there's plenty of room for improvement. And then additionally, what kind of CureDAO is focused on, though, as far as is to create a sustainable kind of project and tokenization mechanism that doesn't, I think in the case of a lot of these projects, they will, the token value will inevitably devolve to zero, whereas the token that is utilized by the DAO and is rewarding these people ultimately will have real world business value in its ability to be used to purchase data sets and to purchase compute time to run machine learning models on existing data by a wide array of business businesses that can use it to create value for their customers. So we're kind of following the Ocean Protocols model, which is a data marketplace and machine learning marketplace, and to maintain the value and sustainability of the ecosystem over time. So hopefully that answers his question about how we might be able to incentivize people through gamification too.
Yes, I think that is a good answer to the question of motivation. And the more one sets up incentives for people to share their data in a way that seems to be convenient or interesting or engaging, and the more one can automate that process, of course, with individual consent, like data being uploaded periodically if the data are gathered in an automated fashion or in a passive fashion, then that would improve the effectiveness of the system from the standpoint of having robust information to analyze. Now we have an interesting question from Dan Elton, our director of scholarship. He asks Mike whether you are familiar with the book from Vinay Prasad on medical reversal. And Dan has heard that the problem you mentioned is particularly acute in chemotherapy because the bar for approval is somewhat low there. So have you had any information about this book? Have you read it? Have you read about it?
I have not read that book. I heard him interviewed, like I think a couple years ago, so I can't really speak incredibly intelligently on that work. If Dan is available, I'd be very interested to hear what he had to say about it. So, and if anyone else has any has read it and has any insights, that would be cool.
Yes. So the book is called Ending Medical Reversal, Improving Outcomes, Saving Lives by Vinayak K. Prasad. And it is available on Amazon for those who are interested in it. So now we have come to a point in our salon where I would like to invite some final questions or comments from our USTP officers. So Art Ramon, please go ahead.
Yeah, I heard that Martin Scarelli was doing some sort of DAO for, it says early drug discovery. Are you familiar with any of that?
Oh, yeah. Are you talking about
Drug-like?
Fleming?
Drug-like is the website, and it says that it's for early democratizing access costs and rewards early stage drug discovery. So it seems to be like a DAO sort of, but it seems to be more oriented for companies. Do you know anything about that?
I am not familiar with that one, but we would like to collaborate with anyone we can. So we have seen a number of existing entities that are that have occurred, like kind of in addition to kind of trying to overcome like this kind of duplication of effort that is producing massive waste in healthcare. We also want to avoid recreating this duplication of effort problem in Web3. So in Web3 entities. So we're trying to partner with anyone we can. So we're currently working on partnerships with Forever Today. There's a project that has this digital twin that is whose health is a function of your own based on data that is acquired. And then Open Cures and Ageless RX are conducting a clinical trial on the effects of rapamycin on aging and longevity. And Lifespan.io has some decentralized clinical trials planned for later in the year next year regarding Alzheimer's disease. And there are a number of other projects that I wanted to. So there's Helome, and so they have that's created by Nikhil, who is working with us, and super great guy. And so they're focused. He's very focused on kind of these aging clocks that are kind of necessary to have an outcome if you want to get a longevity intervention approved for this this endpoint, then you need a quantitative metric to determine that. So he's working on a lot of machine learning models for that. And then reputable health is another one that is focused on quantifying like the effects of supplements to validate lots of health claims that are made. So they're working with kind of a lot of influencers to have them run studies and recruit people to participate in studies. And Deathless DAO and the Foresight Institute and VDAO are kind of working on this longevity prize for finding new ways and hypotheses to accelerate research into human longevity, and then a lot of other partners. So, and we want to add anybody to this list that would be willing to work with us so we can avoid any kind of duplication of effort and facilitate collaboration. That's another benefit of DAOs relative to traditional entities, whereas you can do treasury swaps, and then where your tokens are exchanged between the entities, and then that incentivizes each of you to work towards each other's success and to focus on your unique value proposition, and then outsource as much as you can to any of your partners, so that you aren't wasting a lot of time doing the same thing and competing when there's so much more value to be attained through collaborationism.
Yes, thank you for that response, Mike. And now let us go to Jason. Jason, what final question or comment would you like to pose?
All right, you can count on me for the weird questions. but seriously though, maybe popcorning and ideas can be good. Shout out to Daniel Tweed; he's good at popcorning ideas too. But anyway, what if they were a group of people and they're playing a game about a simulation of a study that is able to actually generate usable data? Would that be necessarily regulated by the FDA in the same way? Or
so there's
just get out of court?
Yeah. So there's like internal review boards that typically regulate even kind of crowdsourced research like this. So I know there's, if it is focused on kind of an intervention, it's kind of unclear at this point, though, because I've seen like there's the Personal Genome Project, which was around earlier and hasn't been so active lately, but there's Open Humans as well, which is another great project you should check out. And they don't, so the Personal Genome Project had like this big ordeal of all these approval and consent forms that you had to fill out before participating. And the same is true for the All of Us program. But then I've seen lots of other entities where you can just like sign up and then share your data. And it seems like if it's not an interventional trial where they are telling you to apply some intervention, then if you're just like sharing observational data about stuff that you've already done on your own, then I'm thinking that should not fall under any kind of regulation, and people should be able, well, they should definitely have the right to do it. And I'm pretty sure there's no kind of legal risks to that, but anybody correct me if I'm wrong.
It sort of seems to make sense to me. I mean, they're just like, if there's anybody that happens to be doing this, let us know. We're not telling you to do it,
Right.
I mean,
Yeah, you definitely don't want to tell anybody to do anything.
Right.
Yes, indeed. There's a big difference between people voluntarily sharing their own information and people being instructed to do so. But I agree, if people voluntarily share their own information in any sort of framework, that data is their property, and they should have the ability to disclose it or not disclose it as they see fit. Now, we have an excellent comment from our friend Jennifer Hughes with regard to how to approach, for instance, the limitations of the medical care system. She writes that people need to realize that not all physicians know how to properly treat a particular medical condition, and they can be told wrong information, but that does not mean there's no treatment or no hope, or that there are no less invasive treatments available than what one is being recommended. Rather, one should keep looking until one finds a solution. So that is very important for people in our community. Never lose hope. Even if a particular doctor is not able to assist you, there may be others who are, and there may be decentralized approaches. There may be information you could get from other patients, or vast amounts of data that in the future will be able to be analyzed a lot more systematically.
Right.
And we
Wait.
do have another question from our friend John H. I think this is an interesting one to pose in the last 4 minutes that we have here. Have DAOs yet proven themselves as entities that motivate greater user participation? Is there much enthusiasm for them, at least so far? And I would be curious for all three of our guests what their observations regarding public enthusiasm for DAOs, and indeed public awareness for DAOs, has been.
I think yes. I think if you look at, it depends on how you define participation. So yeah, if you define interaction and I guess support, financial support, and then I think there's a lot of evidence. If you look at Assange DAO, that was able to raise like $50 million for Julian Assange's defense within like a matter of days or weeks, and the Constitution DAO, which has I think a like significantly is cool, but I think a less urgent mission than kind of curing diseases. They were able to raise about $70 million. Yeah, it depends on the kind of the ability to market and the simplicity of the goal. And I think the simplicity of the goal is kind of critical, and the ability to frame it in a way that will motivate a lot of people. But yeah, so I think, and then I think they're definitely more motivating than if you were to go out and just start a company, like a private company that was trying to do the same thing. You're definitely going to get a lot more like users and interest from partner organizations and things like that in a situation that you can allocate actual ownership to the people that are participating, as opposed to a company where like the owners of the company receive all of the benefits and they're basically not equitably dispersing those. And then Jennifer, was that the previous comment? Yeah,
Yes.
She has a great comment as well. Like it's doctors are amazing, and they are doing the absolute best they can with the resources that they have, but they have so little time. And even if they were to read like every formal research paper that came out, and like they just spent their entire waking hours doing that, by the end of the year, there would be about 500,000 extra papers that haven't been put out. So I think we kind of need to recognize the limits of the human brain. It hasn't evolved much since the time of the caveman. It can hold like 7 numbers in working memory at a time. And so like trying to solve these hyper complex problems, like in the human body, which is comprised, which is a very complex system in itself, and then has like thousands of inputs that are affecting all of these interactions within the system. It's like impossible for any human brain to optimize that. Whereas in kind of electrical engineering, we have lots of times have electronic systems that are hyper complex and that are influenced by tons of noise and radiation from the outside, and then such as like supernova produce these gamma rays and things, just tons of things you can never mathematically account for. So the way that we create these control systems and optimize electrical outputs is using various statistical techniques such as recurrent neural networks and things to kind of create a black box of all the inputs that we know, the noise, and then just adjust the inputs the best we can to produce a desired output. And we got to the moon that way, and achieve everything else that pretty much every electronic device that you use applies the same principle. But in the case of medicine, for some reason, we're still using the exact same tools that we were using thousands of years ago to identify the root causes of disease or mask the symptoms. And in 10 years of going to probably dozens of different doctors, not one of them ever asked me about my diet. And that turned out to be like the absolute most effective means of mitigating the severity of like all of my symptoms, and not one of them kind of ever like kind of was able to identify that this was kind of a autoimmune reaction. All of these symptoms and conditions were just like looked at as isolated conditions that needed some specific drug for those conditions, and there was never any like ability or interest. I'm not sure if it's just like time limitations or some philosophical thing, but there's not really any focus in the traditional medical system on finding root causes. It's more just mostly masking symptoms using kind of a dartboard approach of just trying random things and then going back 3 months later and seeing if you're better or not.
Yes, indeed. Well, we hope that CureDAO will offer a different approach, a new set of technologies and tools for patients to achieve better results than the traditional medical system. And unfortunately, our time today is at an end, but we are very pleased to have had you, Mike, and Lukas, and Andreas, to provide an overview of the CureDAO concept and all of the possibilities for patient empowerment that go with it. And thank you to our wonderful audience, to our USTP officers, for the excellent, enlightening conversation today. Until next time, live long and prosper.
Thank you